All right. Welcome, everybody. We are back for another discussion in Let's Talk Recovery. And again, like it's been all winter, I'm still struggling with some congestion, with some throat issues. And so you're going to hear me clear my throat a little bit tonight. I could possibly cough, but I'm going to try to keep things under control. All right. Now, I want to welcome everybody that comes in tonight, whether you're watching the video live, as I'm talking just now, Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, or whether you're watching a replay on Facebook or on one of my other platforms. I'm going to ask that as you jump in tonight in the comments, share with us where you're checking in from. And as we are talking tonight, if you end up having any questions or any comments, feel free to put those in the comments. And if it's here in the live, I'll try to address those questions here. If you post those later as you're watching a replay, I do check those out and I will try to respond to those. So, some of you were with me last week. I'm back in my regular background. Last week, I was in St. Louis. My grandkids, some of my grandkids, one of my daughters, a son in law, grandkids live in St. Louis. My son in law, Tim, is a pastor in St. Louis. If you live in the St. Louis area or you end up in St. Louis visiting, I would recommend that you check out Hazelwood Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. And in fact, I hope here in the very near future to have Tim and the leader of his Celebrate Recovery program there at the church on here as guests, where they will be talking about the role and responsibility of the church in recovery and in working with members that are involved in recovery. I think that's an important topic and an important role for the church. And so, I was in St. Louis last week. The grandkids were on spring break, and I was watching grandkids and did the live last week from my daughter's basement. And so, but I'm back here at home tonight, and we'll get into our topic here in just a minute. I do want to let you know as we get started, I'll give you a hint on next week. We'll be back again next week, every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Our topic tonight is going to be the stories that we tell ourselves. And next week, we will be taking a look at stress and recovery. And the idea that what we do with stress really matters. A lot of us throw around that word stress, but my experience has been that very few of us have taken the time to think through what stress is, how we respond to it, and what it does to us. And so that'll be our topic next week. Tonight, our topic is the stories that we tell ourselves. And that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. So, in thinking about that, the stories we tell ourselves, my experience personally, and with a lot of the people that I've worked with currently and over the years, my experience has been that most of us in recovery, at least early in recovery, We think recovery is all about stopping behavior, that it's all about getting a behavior under control. And there are all kinds of reasons that we focus on that. The main reason is that our behavior in addiction is what is causing us pain and problems. And so, since that's where the immediate pain is coming from, that's what we tend to focus on is the behavior. But when we focus on the behavior, I kind of compare focusing on the behavior to the idea that I may have a headache. It's present 24/7, nonstop. It's always there. It's causing me pain, causing me distress. So I run down to Costco or I run down to Sam's Club and I buy Advil in the giant bottles. And I pop Advil nonstop, trying to treat the cause of the pain, that headache. And then 6 months or a year or 2 years down the road, I end up dying from a brain tumor that I never knew was present. I die from something that was the root of the problem. And I never really recognized that the problem, the root problem, existed because I've been chasing a behavior. And that's what many of us do in recovery. That's what I did for years in my recovery is I chased the behavior because that is what caused the immediate pain and discomfort in my life. And it's not until we're able to refocus our attention and to dive into to experience and practice curiosity and discover the core, the root cause of our struggle, that's when we're able to begin to gain ground and to make progress. Recovery is not about stopping a behavior. It's about healing and treating the root cause. And one of those causes in our behavior often is really about changing the story that we tell ourselves. Now, what do I mean by that? Changing the story that we tell ourselves. Here's the deal. I give you some simple examples. Most of us have an internal critic or an internal storyline that's constantly running in the back of our brain, in the back of our mind. And we create a story about ourselves. And that's based on the things that we tell ourselves, the way that we talk to ourselves. We create a storyline. We tell ourselves things like, man, you'll never change. You're never going to be successful. You're never going to change. Or we create stories like, this is just who I am. It's the way I was born. You know, I come from a long line of addicts, and I don't really have any options here. It's just who I was born to be. It just runs in my family. Or maybe we build a story based on the idea that I've already messed up too much. I've crossed a line. And when I crossed this line, there's no going back. There's no way to correct the situation. And we build these stories in our mind, and then we tend to live these stories out as if they're fact. They become the script that we live out of. And these stories become a self-fulfilling prophecy. of what life is going to be like. So, what do I mean when I use that term stories? Um, we need to nail this down. Definitions are always an important thing. And so the stories that I'm talking about, stories that we live out, manifest as repeated thoughts. You always fail. You can never make it. You're never going to do better. You can't change. And these become repeated thoughts. And these thoughts pop up all the time. And we've become convinced that they dictate who we are. The stories are based on interpretations of our experiences. We look at our experiences and we decide that past experience dictates future performance. And these stories are oftentimes based on beliefs that we have about ourselves, about others, and about God, and how we relate to God and how we believe He interacts with us. A lot of times, these stories sound like phrases like, well, I'm just not enough. I can't do this. I, I don't have the ability. I'm not smart enough to change. I'm not strong enough to change. Or maybe we base our stories on other people. We tell ourselves people can never be trusted. I have a friend who in recent years has begun to become involved in community and in interacting with others. But a lifelong story for him was that people can never be trusted. People can never be trusted. And that drove him into isolation and convinced him that it was not safe to be vulnerable to anyone. Some of us live out a storyline with an understanding of if people really knew me, they'd leave. If they really knew who I was and what I did and what I think and what I'm like, they would leave. I was in a conversation this morning with somebody. I was down at the coffee shop. All of you that know me know that I live at coffee shops. My favorite hangout. And my favorite coffee shop is a little place in town called Culkin Coffee. And I hang out there. Place is great. Great atmosphere, great people. And I was with somebody this morning, and we were talking about a group that we were in last night. There is a local in-person meeting that I attend. The meeting started a little over 5 years ago, and it's been meeting consistently every Monday evening. And the guys are all meeting there because they struggle with compulsive behaviors. They're not all there for the same struggles. The majority are there because of struggles in one specific area, but you got guys that are there for a lot of different problems. And new guys are constantly coming in. And this guy I was with this morning, he's been attending the meeting, I don't know, 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And we were talking, not he and I, but me and another guy that's been in the group since the beginning. We were talking last night just about the openness in the meeting last night. People just really opening up and sharing about things that they had maybe talked to me about personally before they came into the group, but things that they had sworn they would never talk openly about in front of anybody. And here they were in this group meeting last night, just talking about these secrets that they have kept hidden for years, talking openly in the group. And the gentleman that I was with this morning was telling me, he said, he said, my struggle, well, it's similar to some of the other guys. My struggle has its own little twist that's kind of extra sick. And he said, what has stood out to me is the openness and the freedom that I have to be honest in our group. But he had lived for years, maybe even decades, with that story that he told himself. If people really know me, they'll be gone. They won't want anything to do with me. And he has recognized that while we don't stand on a soapbox and share our story with everybody, there are safe places for us where we can be real. Or another story that a lot of us tell ourselves is, I have to handle this on my own. I can't rely on anybody else. I can't expect anybody else to help me. I have to handle this on my own. And we tell ourselves that story. And that story, when we tell ourselves a story long enough, even if that story is a lie, in practicality, that lie becomes the truth that we live in. It becomes our existence. Now, many times, these stories are formed early in life. Maybe we grew up in an environment where we were told, you never do anything right. Real men handle things themselves. You're always going to be a failure. Or we're told from a young age, you're just stupid. You're not smart. And we begin to believe these stories that are presented to us. They become a part of who we believe ourselves to be. And then many times throughout life, these stories begin to be reinforced by trauma, by shame, or by failure. And a lot of times, this trauma, again, is external and is coming from outside ourselves. This shame is based on lies about who we believe ourselves to be or what the role that we feel that performance plays in our identity. Or we made a mistake once and we tell ourselves that's where we live, is in that mistake. These stories become reinforced by trauma, by shame, or by failure. So, how do these stories show up in recovery? Well, there are a number of common recovery stories that we live in and that we adopt. One of the most common is the shame story. In the shame story, we tell ourselves things like, I've gone too far. I've crossed a line. There's no hope for me. I am broken and different. My story is different from everybody else. Yes, other people find freedom. Other people walk in recovery, but I can't. It's just not possible for me. I'm too far gone. I've crossed that point of no return. And when we step into the shame story leads us to unhealthy places. It leads us into hiding and isolation. We become afraid in our shame to be open and honest with anybody. And so we withdraw and we hide. The shame story can lead us to giving up. We just conclude that I can't be better, and so I need to learn to exist where I'm at. And these things push us into isolation. And what's that little catchphrase, that little slogan that's floating around the recovery world today? The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is community. It's healthy community. And many of us have found that to be true. That's my story. I was never able to gain traction in isolation. And so that shame story, the idea that I am just screwed up, I'm broken, I am hopeless, there's something wrong with me, leads us to hiding, leads us to giving up, and pushes us into isolation. Another common story with people in recovery is the self-reliance story. In this story, we tell ourselves, you need to be able to handle this yourself. You should be able to handle this. You shouldn't have to ask for help. The self-reliance story. I have to do this on my own. And where does the story lead us to? It leads us into not reaching out. We become afraid and ashamed of asking for help. It leads us to avoiding community and accountability. Many times, I have found it beneficial to share with people, man, I'm struggling. And here's where you can help me. Check in with me this week and ask me how I'm doing. Ask me if I'm following through on my daily disciplines. And ultimately, self-reliance leads to burnout. Now, why is that? It's because we were not created and designed to live in isolation. We are designed psychologically to live in healthy relationship. We need one another. And when we try to operate on our own, when we refuse to ask for help, we live in a perpetual state of white knuckling, of hanging on that edge and refusing to ask for help. And eventually, we lose grip, we lose strength, we become exhausted, we become burned out, and we relapse and we fall. What's another story that we sometimes live in? Another story is the hopeless story. Nothing ever changes. Nothing changes for me. I've been like this since I was a little kid. I can't get better. I can't change. All kinds of storylines play into that. Maybe addiction runs in our family. And so we convince ourselves that we're destined to live in addiction. We convince ourselves that we're hopeless. Nothing ever changes. And where does this story lead us to? It leads us to lower effort. Now, why is that? It's because we convince ourselves that no matter what we do, it's not going to change. So why even try? That's a natural result from this storyline. It leads us into a pattern of drifting. We just drift through life. We drift along expecting failure, expecting relapse, expecting that nothing will change. And this does consistently lead to eventual relapse. And why is that? It's because we have convinced ourselves that we don't have any other option, that we don't have any other choice, that we can't change, that life is hopeless. And then one last storyline that I'll touch on here that some of us live in and believe in is the performance study. If I just do everything right, I'll be okay. A lot of us drift in and out of this story, the performance story, and this manifests in a lot of ways. If I can just set enough rules, if I can just read the right book, and we live in that state of looking for those 3 secret rules that will change life forever, that'll put us in a place where we can perform and that we won't have to work any longer. If I just do the right thing, read the right book, listen to the right podcast, if I just do everything right, I'll be okay. Performance. And where does this storyline lead us to? It leads us to a place of compliance instead of transformation. Now, I got to be honest with you. I hate that word, compliance. Why don't you just comply? We're not created for compliance. Compliance says just do what you're told. Honestly, there are things in recovery that are beneficial across the board, or for the majority of people, things like often meetings, groups, things like making that phone call, like daily disciplines. There are things that work, but even while those things are true and work for many people, there are no two people where the recovery journey, that road to recovery, is exactly identical. I can't do exactly everything that you do and expect it to be successful for me. You can't expect to do everything exactly like I do it and it be successful for you. Compliance, following a hard set of rules, reading the right books, taking the right 3 steps doesn't work. This kind of storyline leads to constant, continual pressure and stress. We're going to be talking next week about stress. You need to come back next week when we examine a definition of stress. We all throw that word around, but very few of us have taken the time to ask ourselves, what does stress really mean? The performance story leads to pressure and leads to stress. We're living under a constant sense that we have to do more. It leads to a life of busyness. If I just keep myself busy, I won't have time to act out. Busyness leads to exhaustion, and exhaustion leads to relapse. This storyline will not work. Performance. And ultimately, this performance storyline leads to shame when we fall short, when we don't quite meet that mark that we set for ourselves. It results in shame. So, why does this matter? Why does the story we tell ourselves matter? Well, people don't act randomly. A lot of us like to think we do. A lot of us think we fly by the seat of our pants. We think that we are spontaneous, but we're not. People don't act randomly. We act in alignment with the story that we believe. So, for instance, some examples of this. If somebody believes I'm going to fail anyway, I can't help it, what does that lead to? It leads us to a place where we stop trying. And then what happens when we stop trying? That story that we have believed becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. And it reinforces itself. If somebody believes nobody cares, nobody can be trusted, where does that lead? It leads us to a place of isolation. And I would argue, feel free to disagree with me. You don't have to agree with everything that I say. But when we move to that place of isolation, when we convince ourselves that nobody cares and we isolate, sobriety cannot be maintained in isolation. The particular struggle that we have may stop, but we'll trade one unhealthy behavior for another. Or what if somebody believes I'm just not worth it? I'm not worth other people investing in me, helping me, caring for me. When that's the story we believe, we begin to self-sabotage. Even if we begin to do well, we create a reason to fail. And failure becomes the expectation. It becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. We live out that story that we believe. So the question then arises, how do we change that story? How do we change that story that we believe? You know, I'll give you an example of how this works. And I don't want you to get caught up in a side thought here. There are all kinds of different ideas on things like counting days, okay? I'll be honest with you. Some people counting days is a healthy thing for them and it works well in their recovery. For some people, it becomes self-sabotage. The important thing isn't whether we count days or not. For some people it works and for some it doesn't. And all of life is like that. There's not a one-size-fits-all pattern. But there was a guy several years ago that began to meet with me. And he had been in recovery for a couple of years. And when we talked in that first meeting, and I asked him, I said, explain to me where you're at in recovery, in your recovery journey. And he told me, he said, I've been in recovery a couple of years. And he said, honestly, I just can't make it to 30 days without relapse. He said, I've been in recovery 2 years and I've never hit 30 days. I've had a lot of people give me that story. And I asked him to explain that to me, to talk to me about that. And he told me, he said, well, I track days. He said, somebody early on told me that if you're in recovery, you have to count days. And so he counted days. I think he was actually using an app, and I don't have a problem with an app. But he said, I start off good. I have my daily disciplines in place. And he said, I start off good and I do really well for 2 weeks or just a little bit better. He said, but as I begin to move towards 3 weeks, I begin to struggle a little bit. As I cross that 3-week line, I can really feel that battle start in me. I want to act out. And he said that begins to escalate and continues to escalate. And he said, as a general rule, somewhere between day 26 and day 29, I relapse. I fail. I fall short. He said, it's like there's a wall and I just can't get by it. And he said, I think I'm destined to be stuck here. He said, in fact, this might just be where I spend the rest of my life. Is I just fail about once every 28 days or so. I act out. This just might be where I live the rest of my life. Now, what was the story that he was telling himself? The story he was telling himself was that he could not experience long-term recovery. The story he was telling himself was that he could not reach 30 days. And as we talked, he told me, he said, I go to that app every day, every morning when I get up, I go to my app to see how many days I've had. And he told me, he said, based on where I'm at in my number of days, I know first thing in the morning when I get up and when I go to my app, I know what my day is going to be like. I know whether I'm going to struggle or whether it's going to be a good day. I know how the day is going to go. Do you hear what's happening? He has created a story around an app and around a number of days. And so I challenged him. I said, let's do this. Delete the app. I said, when did you last relapse? And he gave me a date. I said, all right, I've written that down. It's right here in your folder. I have the date that you last relapsed. Delete the app and make a commitment to me that you are not going to write anything down on a calendar. You're not going to count your days. You're not going to track your days. But there are a couple things you're going to commit to me. You have my word. I will track your days. I will track your days. And your commitment to me is when you relapse, you have to tell me within 24 hours. Within 24 hours, you have to notify me that you have relapsed. Can we do this? And he said, yes. And then we went to work. We began as coaching. We started looking at some tools. We started digging into some attachment theory work. We began digging into needs. I use an approach that behind every behavior is a feeling, behind every feeling is a need. feelings are good things. We need to learn how to experience feelings and process feelings in a healthy way. And through those feelings, we can discover the needs that are behind those. And we begin to do some work. And we met. And he did once or twice, he reached out to me and he told me I relapsed. And he followed through just like he said he would within 24 hours. But we continued to meet. Time moved on. And one day, as we were in a session, I asked him, I said, hey, man, are you tracking your days? Are you tracking anything on a calendar? Are you counting days in your head? And he told me, he said, no. He said, I've been doing my best not to do that, just like we agreed to. And I asked him, I said, well, do you have an idea of where you're at? If you had to guess, where would you say that you're at in days? And he told me, he said, it's funny you should ask. He said, I felt it building up inside of me recently. He said, based on what I've been feeling the last couple of days, he said, I would say that I'm a little over 3 weeks. I'm probably about day 23 or 24. He said, I can feel it building up inside of me. And so I started into another discussion and he backed me up really quick. He said, no, hold on. He said, you asked me what I thought. He said, where am I at? Am I right? He said, because I'm feeling like I've got just a few days and I'm going to be acting out. And I smiled and laughed. And I told him, I said, oh, you've got 24 days. In fact, you've got about double that. You're at about 46 days since your last relapse. And if you could have seen the look on his face when I told him that, and he immediately questioned, are you sure? Are you sure that you, and I went back through his messages he had sent me and found the last date when he had sent me a relapse. I said, have you told me the truth? He said, yes, I've reported it. I said, you're over 40 days. And the smile, first a look of confusion and disbelief, and then a smile. And he said, this can't be right. I've been in recovery for over 2 years, and I've never made it 30 days. I said, dude, you're over 40 days. You're over 40 days. And do you know what the difference is between now and what you've experienced in the past? You haven't been clinging to that story of limitation and of failure. You set that story aside and you're living a different storyline. You're living a different experience. Did he relapse again? He did. But his approach to recovery and his trajectory changed dramatically. And he's doing well in his recovery today. That idea of I can't get past 30 days, that's something from the past and a memory. He can't even contemplate having lived like that because he was able to set aside that story that he had believed for years and begin to walk and live into a new story in his life. So, how do we change the story? Let me get back to that. How do we change the story that we're living? Here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to think about. Feel free to take some notes here. There are some steps here that are important. First, we have to identify the story that we're living. We need to ask ourselves a question. What am I telling myself right now? What are you telling yourself right now? Are you telling yourself, I'll never get over this? Are you telling yourself, I can't change? Are you telling yourself, this is just my destiny? It's the story of my family passed down generation to generation. We have to begin by noticing and identifying the story that we are living in. Your question is, what am I telling myself right now? What is the story that I'm living? We need to identify that. And then step 2, we need to say that out loud. When we say something out loud, it loses its hold and its grip on us. When we're able to speak that out and verbalize it, we're able to recognize that it's false. Stories lose their power when they're spoken. You can tell yourself, I always fail. But as soon as you speak that out, as soon as you identify that and speak that out loud, a thought's going to pop into your head of that one time recently when you didn't fail, when that story was not true. And that becomes powerful in your life. It becomes something you can hold on to, something you can grip, something you can stand on as you take that next step forward. When we speak it, then step 3 is we challenge it. We challenge that belief. We need to ask ourselves a couple questions. Is this story that I'm living, this story that I'm telling myself, this story that I've been told by my friends and my family, is this story actually true? And question number 2 there is, where did this story come from? Odds are it's something that you've heard, something that you've been told, something that's been used against you to manipulate you and to control you. And you've allowed it to control you. And then step 4, we replace that false story with truth. Now we have to be careful here. We don't want to try to replace that false story with hype. We don't want to replace one untruth with another untruth, even if it's an untruth that's exaggerated slightly in the positive. We want to replace it with truth, not with fake positivity, but grounded truth. For instance, with the story we may have been living is, I always fail. And maybe a statement of truth is, I'm struggling. We change that idea that I live constantly struggling to a story based in truth. I'm struggling, but I don't have to struggle alone. So we recognize that struggle, but we connect that struggle with an additional truth. I'm struggling, but I'm struggling and I'm not alone. I don't have to do this alone. Or maybe we take that story we've been living, that story that says, I'll never change. We identify it, we speak it out loud, we identify where it came from. We heard that one from as far back as we can remember. You'll never change. You'll never be any better. We take that story that we've been living in, that we've allowed to define us, and we speak truth. Our story changes from, I'll never change, maybe to something like, change is hard. But I've taken steps before, and I can take steps again. Do you see how that works? We recognize the struggle. We're not confessing, we're not trying to speak into existence this idea that I'm never going to struggle again, that I'm never going to take another drink as long as I live. That can be as detrimental to us as telling ourselves, I don't have any choice but to drink. We take our story into a place of truth and honesty. I'm struggling, but I don't have to do this alone. I'm not alone. Change is hard, but I've taken steps before. I can take a step today. And then we begin to live into a new story. Change in our life, change in our recovery, change in ourselves happens through action. We don't settle for what's always been. At the same time, we don't expect perfection. But we do take action. We set goals. We begin to put in place daily disciplines. We pick up tools that we can use when we struggle. Change also happens through connection. That may be a group, that may be a sponsor, that may be a list of 4 people that I can pick up the phone and call when I am struggling. Now you might ask, why 4? It's because if all you have is 1, there are going to be times when they can't answer the phone. And we need to have other options. And then change happens through consistency. That's why I talk about, and I've repeated several times, daily disciplines. Consistency on a regular basis. Consistency. Consistency in using tools, making phone calls. Some people hear about phone calls and they think, well, I just need to make a phone call anytime I struggle. Nah, that's crap. You need to begin by making a phone call every day, because if you don't get into the habit of making a phone call every day, when you are struggling, shame will become activated and you won't make a phone call then either. So you start by making those phone calls when things are going good. And that enables you to make a phone call when you're struggling. It can be that you start your morning with a 2 or 3 minute meditation. Now, here's what you don't do. You don't decide, I'm going to get up every morning and I'm going to meditate for an hour. You've set yourself up for failure. Maybe in the beginning you say, I'm going to get up and I'm going to start with 2 or 3 slow, deep breaths. in through your nose for the count of 4, out through your mouth for the count of 6 or 8. And we decide I'm just going to begin with 4 breaths every morning as soon as my feet hit the floor. I'm going to begin with a 2-minute meditation. Not something that I can't follow through with. Something small that as it becomes consistent can be expanded if we want to. So change happens through action, through a plan, through connection, accountability, community. Not somebody that's going to point a finger and call us out all the time about what we're doing wrong. Somebody that's able to sit and listen to me share my struggles. And I don't have to be concerned that I'm going to be judged or that I'm going to be shamed. I just need somebody to listen and to let me talk things through. And then these things need to be done with consistency. With consistency. Not hit and miss where I do it 5 times this week and I do it once next week, 4 times the following week, and then it's out the window and it's gone. It doesn't need to be your New Year's commitment to a workout at the gym. It needs to be consistent in our lives. And then I'll add one more thing. We need to begin to journal. Now, if you're like me, people used to tell me, Ron, you need to journal. I refused to just because people told me I should. And I'll be honest with you, I had a long period of time, even as I began to write things down, where just because I'm stubborn, just because I'm hard-headed, I decided I am not going to journal, but maybe I'll just start to take a few notes on how my day went. You see what I did there? I didn't give in to journaling, but I did journal. I just called it something else. But we began to write down. I've talked before about the process I use for checking questions with myself. What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What have I been doing today? And what am I thinking about doing? What's on my mind that's coming up, that's adding some pressure and some stress and that's taking my focus? And as I begin to journal, I begin to identify patterns. You know what? When I do this, it seems to help and things go better. When I do this, I tend to struggle a little more. And I begin to identify patterns. And I begin to tweak things, and change began to take place. So, how am I going to land this today? Well, let me just close with a statement. I'll use the same statement that I started with, or at least part of it. Recovery isn't just about stopping a behavior. It's not just about stopping a behavior. Recovery is about learning to recognize and rewrite the stories that we've been living out for years. And we refuse to accept those stories that have kept us in a state of turmoil and in a state of not being able to believe in ourselves and not being able to expect progress. We don't focus on the behavior. We begin to identify where that behavior is coming from, what's behind that. We express curiosity. How did I develop this storyline that I'm always going to fail? Where did this come from? Is this something I've heard from somebody? Is it a story that I've created in my own head? And then we begin to reshape that story. And we begin to track what's taking place in our lives. We identify patterns. And we begin to recognize progress and success. Here's my final question for you. I like to end with questions. What is a story that you've told yourself that's held you back in recovery? What's a story that you can identify that you might ask yourself, is this true? Or is this a lie that I've been believing? Is this a story that needs to be replaced with the truth? I want to invite you, if you've heard something tonight that's spoken to you, something that has stirred some curiosity, stirred some thought, I'd invite you to reach out. Visit my website, rw-coaching.com. Check me out on social media. You're watching me now on Facebook or on YouTube or on one of my other platforms. Shoot me a message. If you have a question, shoot me your question. I'd be happy to talk with you. You can email me, rwcoaching2@gmail.com. Man, I'd be happy to sit with you and hear some of your story and help you identify the true story that's possible for you in your recovery and in your life. And again, remember, next week we'll be back 8 p.m. Tuesday evening for Let's Talk Recovery. Join me again next week. Have a good evening.